Good afternoon. My name is Adrienne Arsht, and I'm the Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council. I'm delighted to welcome those of you here in Washington who came through the rain, and those who are joining us virtually from around the world. Reporters at Risk, Editors' Perspectives. Today's discussion is hosted by the Adrienne Arsht National Security Resilience Initiative, which I founded last year. The initiative, housed within the Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, works to advance resilience as a core tenet of U.S. and allied national security policy and practice, examining sources of and developing strategies for enhancing the ability of individuals, communities, and systems to withstand and recover from national security shocks. Today's event is part of our Reporters at Risk series, which convenes leading foreign correspondents to discuss the risks reporters face on the front line of crises and conflict, and ways to build individual and collective press resilience. I will take a moment of personal privilege and tell you how I interacted in this. A little while ago, about 10 o'clock at night, I got a call from the editor at CNN who said, Adrienne, we have a reporter, David Culver. He's on the border between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and they're not letting him get into Haiti, and we need your help. So I didn't think about what I was sending him into, as all of you all will talk about. Anyway, several of us made some calls, and the next day at 5 o'clock on the CNN News, there was David from Port-au-Prince. And I watched with a degree of anxiety as bullets flew, and he was in the middle of a conflict. So, being on that side of it, I've always wondered how the people who really manage that live with themselves. Well, last year, the event series helped to raise awareness of the arbitrary detention of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. We advocated consistently and continually for his release, and I remember watching on television as the plane that returned him circled and landed, and he debarked from the plane. We're joined by a really all-star cast of panelists and speakers today. They will share with you their perspective on what it takes to remain resilient as a journalist out in the field or at home at the command center. We'll explore the special dynamic between reporters and editors, what goes into the tough decisions that editors must make in order to ensure the safety of their reporters working in dangerous locations and getting the story. The Reporters at Risk series, the National Security Resilience Initiative, and other council programs help build the blueprint for a more resilient and secure world. And now I will turn this over to my dear friend, Eugene Daniels, MSNBC's senior Washington correspondent and co-host of The Weekend and president of the White House Correspondents Association, who will moderate. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrienne, for those opening remarks and all the work that you do, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for having me. Like Adrienne said, my name is Eugene Daniels. I'm at MSNBC. You can watch The Weekend, 7 to 10 a.m. Saturdays and Sundays. Thank you very much for keeping me employed. I'm also, as she said, the president of the White House Correspondents Association, and so this is an issue, Reporters at Risk, that is very close to our hearts. Very excited to be here today because it's imperative that journalists around the world have the safety and freedom to be able to help the American people, help the world understand what's going on in far-flung places around the world. I want to start by briefly introducing our panelists here on stage with me. Tom Bowman, if you guys can wave. Tom Bowman is NPR's national desk reporter covering the Pentagon, where he has traveled to Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, often for month-long visits and while embedded with U.S. Marines and soldiers. Lori Goodstein, who I think is virtual, there we go, she's right behind us here, is the deputy international editor for the New York Times. She was previously the national correspondent at the Times covering religion, where she reported from across the United States, Rome, India, England, and the Dominican Republic. Next, we have David Wood, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. David has worked for Time Magazine, the LA Times, Newhouse News Service, the Baltimore Sun, and the Huffington Post. He's reported from Russia and China during the Cold War and covered guerrilla wars in Africa as Time Magazine's Nairobi bureau chief in the 1970s. And last but not least, many of you know him, Fred Kemp, the CEO and president of the Atlantic Council. Fred was previously an editor and reporter at the Wall Street Journal, where he served as assistant managing editor, international, and columnist. Prior to that, he was the longest-serving editor and associate publisher ever of the Wall Street Journal Europe, running the global Wall Street Journal's editorial operations in Europe and the Middle East. Very impressive, Fred. I want to start with sort of a broad question to everyone. Does it feel like a more dangerous time to be a reporter, both abroad and maybe here at home, and if so, why? Tom, I want to start with you.
Yeah, I think it's definitely much more dangerous now. And most of my time was in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and I would embed with U.S. forces. So there's a certain safety element when you're with U.S. forces. But today, if you're looking at the conflicts that we're facing, Gaza, first of all, reporters can't go into Gaza, so we have to rely on those already there. And we have a very heroic producer, Anas Baba, that's been working in Gaza since the Gaza campaign started. And there have been more than 200 Palestinian journalists who have been killed in Gaza. Very, very hazardous situation. And then with Ukraine, there are no U.S. forces there. You can embed every once in a while, I believe, with Ukrainian forces. But there are restrictions, I believe, the Ukrainians are placing on reporters where they can and can't go. And also in both situations here, unlike what we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, no one's firing missiles at you. That's a particular hazard. We wear our body armor and our helmets, to prevent getting shot at. But if a missile's coming in, that's not going to help you. Yeah. And political challenges too, I think. Depending on where you are in Ukraine, you could easily get kidnapped. The same is true, I think, particularly reporters who have gone into Russia, into that area, the Kursk area, it's very hazardous going in there because if the Russians get you, it's not going to be good. So it is, I think, for those reasons, a bit more hazardous, what we're seeing now.
Laura, do you agree that it is more dangerous overseas, and why? What do you think's behind that?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on this, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person with you, especially for something so important, so dear to my heart. So I do think it's more, I think there's a way in which repression of the press is a bit infectious. And so if one country begins to say, well, you can't come in to cover a war, as happened in Ethiopia, many countries are closing their borders, and then they get away with it, and other leaders look aside and say, well, I can do that too. And so we are, if you look at the stats just from the Committee to Protect Journalists, there are more journalists now in prison than ever before in this year, and also a couple years ago as well. There are, there's been 30 some reporters killed already this year. So it's, Tom talked about some of the on the ground risks. Also I would add in there, drones, IEDs, things that make it really, really dangerous to be in the field on the front lines. So between the political repression and the inability to report, and also what people are facing in the field, it's gotten really risky.
Yeah. Fred, Lori just said something that's really interesting to me. She said repression is infectious. Keeping reporters out is infectious. Once someone starts that, others start to pick up on the same thing. Is that something you're seeing as well?
Yeah. So during my career, I covered international places for the Wall Street Journal, and it was probably the best, in my view, the best job in print journalism because the journal at that time didn't really cover news and didn't care to cover news. What it wanted to do was front page color stories, these long features that the front page was built to do. And there's a group of foreign correspondents, most of us for a time based out of London, and we would go out and do these things. And so I spent time in tough situations in Afghanistan and Beirut and Iraq and in Panama. But we never, as Wall Street Journal journalists, felt we had to get shot at, that we had to put ourselves in harm's way. We did, but it was more by accident than by intention. You were going out and trying to figure out how people were living in the southern suburbs of Beirut, and you'd come back to your hotel and a rocket would hit it, or a car bomb would go off, or something like that. And so you knew you were taking risks. And there were two kinds of journalists in the time, and I probably spent more time in a war zone in Beirut than anywhere else. Other places I went in and out. Beirut, I was there for a long time. And there were two types of journalists. There were what I call morphine journalists. That for them, danger was morphine, and they just needed it in their bloodstream, and they needed it almost every day, every week. Many of them were French, and many of them were photographers. I don't know why that was the case, but it was photographers, it was cameramen, people who had to get close, and the people attracted to that work tended to be the type of people. So you really had a difference between the cynical and the impenetrable, and the I describe as the perceptive and the approachable, and we all go and do these things for different reasons. But at that time, the danger was what might happen to you by accident, and you had to avoid doing stupid things, putting yourself in a place where the bomb's going to hit. And I think what really changed was, and for me it changed in Beirut, was when my friend Terry Anderson of AP was kidnapped in 1985. I played tennis with him all the time, I played tennis with him a couple of times in Beirut, and he was kidnapped after a tennis match in Beirut, for God's sakes. And then, later you had the beheading of Danny Pearl, a very close friend of mine, someone I worked with closely. And I think your innocence was lost then, where you saw, oh my God, it's not just by accident reporters are going to get hurt, it's going to be by intention. By intention, Terry was kidnapped, and luckily he was released 6-7 years later. And Danny wasn't as lucky, but he was kidnapped to be held hostage and for a purpose and to send a message. And so I can't really place where that changed, but that's what changed. And that also then changed how editors decided to send people to places. You started having more stringers, more freelancers, a little bit less staff people, a little less money put into it. You had more training. We paid enormous quantities to train the people that we sent into places like that. You had more security. When you sent somebody to Iraq, you would send them in with sometimes security guards, sometimes armed cars. It just became more difficult, except for any but the richest organizations to fund. And so there was a real sea change in the whole nature of the danger to war correspondents. And I wouldn't say just war correspondents. Danny wasn't covering a war. He just happened to be in Karachi at the wrong time. And so the dangers aren't in a war zone. The dangers really can be in any zone. I mean, Evan Gershkovich was not in a war zone.
David, with all of that said about the kind of difficulties that have come up to cover these places, despite the immense need that the world needs to know what's actually going on in these places, talk about the balance of those things.
Yeah, good question. So I was just going to say that for me, the change from external risk to internal risks came. For me, I spent a lot of time in Africa covering wars there. I had absolutely no training, just jumped into it. I was terrified the entire time. But there was some weird thing that was like, I'd go out and just stumble upon a conflict and be talking to people, and it was like I was a ghost. It was like they didn't see me as a real person. And I remember one time I went, I think this was some of the fighting between Ethiopia and Somalia, and spent some time on the Somali side, and then I went around a couple weeks later, I was on the Ethiopian side, and the commander there said, "So I understand you've just been over on the Somali side. What's going on there? How's their ammunition holding up? What's their, their mood like?" And I said, I can't tell you that, but I'm writing it. You can read the magazine next week. And I was working for Time Magazine. And he goes, "Oh, okay." I mean, that doesn't happen anymore. And it was, I think when I was covering the war in Bosnia that I suddenly realized that I'm a target. And it was, so when was that? 93, 94, somewhere around there. So it was a little bit later than you came to the same realization in Beirut. But I knew there were guys hunting me as a journalist. And so in addition to having to worry about, do I go down that road, which is probably mined, but maybe not, but there's a story at the end of it. How good is this story? If I get blown up, is somebody going to explain to my kids I was doing something important? How do you judge that? And my answer was always, well, if I don't go down that road, what am I doing here? So you go down that road. But in addition to those risks, now all of a sudden, in Bosnia, you had to be super aware of a car creeping along the street, guys are going to jump out and get you, or you're always thinking about being in a protected place, which really crimps your reporting. So after that, I just embedded with the U.S. Army or Marines, and that's how I went to Iraq and Afghanistan. And boy, talk about a feeling of comfort. It was great. So I didn't really get to your question. But
That's okay. You gave us a lot of good stories. And we'll get to the heart of the question throughout the rest of the time that we have. For those of you that are watching, askac.org. Go there. You can submit a question, written, audio, or video. So powder your face, get some of that concealer on there, and send us a video, and we will play some of them at the end here. Lori, you've done both gigs, reporter, now editor. What do you do to make sure that the reporters you send into these war-torn places come home safely, because you've been in their position?
Well, I would say that we are actually both quite cautious and quite professionalized about it now. I mean, some of the stories, you're recounting about just sort of dropping into places. That's not how we're doing it now. And we have one golden rule above all, which is that the security of the correspondent is paramount. It is more important than getting the story. And it's not just the security of the reporter. You have to consider there's often a whole team with that reporter. There's a photographer, there may be a fixer, there is a driver, there could be a translator, and often these are local folks who are in many ways more at risk than the correspondent who's a foreigner coming in from outside. So we always are starting with the question of balancing, is the story target worth the risk? And is there a way to get the story and minimize the risk? And if there is, then how do we do that? So, for instance, in Sudan, when we got information that the army was blocking humanitarian aid from getting into the Darfur region, we could not get into Darfur. We tried. But we could get into Chad and get to the border and see the trucks that were stopped at the border. So you're always looking for, how can you tell the story? How can you prove the case while not taking, putting your reporter and your team at risk? And we do work with security advisors. They are of tremendous help, but I think one thing I definitely want to get across is that any reporter, even if you're an independent reporter or freelance, you can go through the same kind of protocol that that we do and that, the professionals do, and you should, and that there are resources out there to help you. It's not, I think that the days of, freelancers just jumping in, unprepared. I think we're past those days. Nobody should be doing that now. There are too many, first of all, there's too much risk, and second of all, there's too many resources out there. If you look at the website for the Committee to Protect Journalists, there's a tab, about, risk assessment. There's even a whole protocol that can help you, assess risk. There's the INSEE organization also, which, if you go on their website, they will, INSI, they will tell you, it's a great resource for if you're, not linked up with a journalistic organization or you're working on your own. These are resources that you can use. And so we, before we send anybody in the field, we do a lot of groundwork with putting together a whole security plan. And it includes everything from, what kind of a car or transport are you going to be in? Who's driving? Where are you going to be, staying overnight? What kind of PPE, personal protective equipment, do you need? Do you have that with you? What else is in that plan? It's a whole checklist that is actually quite. Communications equipment. Do you have your BGAN with you? Do you have your Thuraya radio? These are things that will keep you connected, even if you're somewhere that there's no internet, no cell, whatever. These are things that I think worth investing in if you don't already have. So the basic idea, though, is to keep you also in touch with your editors, and so that you're not completely off the map. I mean, I think we used to send reporters out for 6 weeks at a time, and they wouldn't talk to an editor. We don't do that anymore. We check in multiple times a day on WhatsApp or on Signal through group chats, and so we always know where our people are in the field.
If I could just add, I think the sad reality is if you decide to cover conflict, you can never be 100% safe. 2016, my photographer and I were having dinner with a Green Beret colonel who we knew in Afghanistan. And as we left, he said, "I'm not going to tell you to be safe where you're going. You can't be safe, just be careful." And that was a year that my photographer was killed in an ambush. We were in an ambush with David Gilkey and our colleague Zabi Tamana, fellow journalist and interpreter. We were set up. It was an ambush. And how do you prevent that? We just had a meeting with the provincial governor in Helmand province, great interview. What we didn't realize was the security chief for the province wanted to kill Americans because he was upset that the American troops weren't killing his rivals. And the Americans said, "They're not Taliban. You just don't like these guys." So he decided he was going to kill Americans. And here we come. Now, how do you prevent that? Prevent it by not going? We were with the Afghan army, which in hindsight maybe was a bit too risky. Because in the ambush, rather than blowing through the ambush, these guys stopped and started shooting. You never do that.
David, how do you mentally prepare the reporters and editors who may be ambushed, who have to deal with this? Because most of these folks, I'm military brat, so and I know most of these folks are not trained in Army combat, right? When you're someone trained in the military, as soon as shooting starts, you know what to do, right? If somebody shoot at me, I'm not going to have any clue what to do, right? Even if I want to cover a story. So how do you mentally prepare a correspondent who may, as Tom here had, get ambushed?
Boy, that's a really good question. And based on my own experience, I would say that that training with the military before you go is a great thing to do. And I spent a lot of years in the 80s and 90s just going out and hanging out with a Marine or Army battalion out in the field doing training. And they learned how to handle a reporter,
Being in the way.
in a firefight. And I learned, don't stand there, stand over here, or don't run now run. Learned all that kind of thing. So by the time the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan came around, we were pretty much used to each other. The difficulty, and I want to get into the whole idea of resilience here, if I can creep ahead, but being an embedded reporter was a really lonely kind of thing because you're not one of them, even though you're traveling with them, you're eating what they do, sleeping where they do, taking the risks that they do, because you're going on missions with them. And these would be 3 or 4 month embeds for me. And it was really, really lonely. And what I learned there was the key to resilience, for me anyway, was community. And that was, as much as I could feel a part of what was going on, that I was buddies with these guys, that they would save my life if it came to that. That was a good feeling. But also the phone call home, and by home I don't mean necessarily home, but back to my editor or anyone. I remember one time someone called up from one of the NPR radio programs, and it was someone who voice that I knew. It felt so good. She said, "How are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm okay." But it just felt really good to connect. And so that personal connection, sense of community, for me, was key to staying resilient and doing the job that I went there to do.
Yeah. Fred, when you were making decisions about sending folks out, what are the hard ones you've had to make to ensure the safety of the reporters in the field while balancing the need to tell the story they know will have impact? Because, I've met a lot of the war correspondents, and these are people who are like, I don't want to leave. This story has to be told. They become a part of the communities that they are covering. And so when you're saying to them, no, you have to go, there's a push and pull there that happens where they're pulling and saying, no, I need to tell this story. What are the hard decisions you've had to make?
So I'm going to tell this from the standpoint of print journalism, or digital journalism. It's quite different. The more encumbered you travel to an organization, the further you're going to be from actually being able to learn about it. If you're going in with a bunch of cameras and you're going in with a armored truck, and you may feel that you're safer, and you probably are safer, but you're probably not going to learn as much about the place as if you're really blend in and you're not getting noticed. And so I tried to travel unencumbered. Except for sometimes you needed a fixer, sometimes you needed a translator. And I would dress however I could dress. I mean, even in Afghanistan, I don't look a lot like a mujahideen, but I did wear a turban, and I grew a beard, and I was behind Soviet lines for 3-4 weeks with mujahideen, on my own and with a translator, and you really learn in a situation like that. And so I've been in those situations. I've sent people in such situations. I think having been in it made me understand who to send and not to send. We would train, and people would go through their trainings. You have to check in twice a day. Don't want to go into details, but some people who have gotten into trouble and have lost their lives have not actually listened to their training, where they've they got in a car they shouldn't have got in. They met somebody in a place they should have had somebody else along with them. They're just protocols that keep you safer while not over encumbering you. The toughest thing was sending somebody into a place of danger for the first time, because you don't quite know, and you don't always know whether something's going to be a place of danger when you first send people in. And so, I just was very reluctant to send adrenaline junkies into places where they would get adrenaline. What you want is people who really are interested in the human condition, people who are really interested in finding out what's going on, and people who aren't particularly interested in getting shot at. Getting shot at is not the prize.
Right.
The prize is getting on page 1 or getting into one of the feature sections and telling people something they don't know about the place. And so I'm going to use an example of a reporter who I still think is one of the finest reporters anywhere, who I hired at the Wall Street Journal. His name is Yaroslav Trofimov, and he's still one of the great writers for the Wall Street Journal. He must have spoke every language on earth. And whatever country he was in, everyone thought he was from another country. You didn't actually know where he was from, right? So if he was in the Arab world, he looked Arab, and if he was, if he was in Ukraine, he actually is Ukrainian, so he also looked Ukrainian, he could speak the language, and he was just the most remarkable human being. And he would just come back with knowledge nobody else had. And nobody even knew he went in the country. He just went in and came out, and so if I could hire 24 Yaroslav Trofimovs, that's who you do. Someone who wants knowledge, somebody who wants to know about the human condition, someone who doesn't need their ego fed by being in a war zone, and someone who doesn't need to come home and talk at the bar about how they almost died. And I mean, if you've almost died, either it's been a mistake and you just were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but if you brought it on yourself, oh, God help you. Why did you do that? There's very rare situations where you actually need to do that to understand what's going on in a country or a situation. So, and also, I would always ask a reporter before going in, why are you going? What's your purpose? Be on page 1. Let's drill down a little deeper. What story would get you there? What is it you're going to tell me that I can't read in 3 other organizations or I can't see on the nightly news? Why am I sending you in this place? And so you really talk it through before the person goes in. So they're also thinking through, well, why am I there? What am I going to come back with? Your job as an editor is not to give some young reporter an experience they've always dreamed of. Your job as an editor is to send great reporters out to give your readers a greater understanding of what's actually going on in the world. And I think we can never, in the excitement of a story, sometimes we let the excitement of a story overtake what's our purpose as journalists.
Tom, everyone's talked about the editor-reporter relationship, a lot of it at the beginning, right, before you get there. But when someone is actually there, when they're on the ground, it seems dangerous. You guys are getting, input from different places. You may be seeing things that the person on the ground isn't seeing. How do you navigate those moments when your reporter and the editor says, no, that's too dangerous, you need to stop? Because intrinsically, you're there to tell a story.
It never happened with me, I think.
They were like, he's good. He ready to fight.
But again, it's Annie Garrels, who worked with me at NPR, one of the great correspondents.
One of the best.
After we lost David and Zabi, she called me and she said, Tom, you remember you only have so much luck. And I think that's wise. But, I would go again for 4 weeks or 5 weeks, go out with Marines or soldiers all around Afghanistan. So you have a conversation with the editor. Where are you going, Tom? What are you going to do different this time that you didn't do last year? A lot of, it evolved into how are the Afghans doing? They're supposedly taking over the fight. So are they really ready? That was one of the stories we would tell. And I remember being in a combat outpost talking to a sergeant. This is all on tape. And we're all ready to go. We have our helmets and vests on and everything. And this is at a time when the Afghans were supposedly leading the fight, right? So we're sitting there talking to the sergeant. This Afghan guy comes up, no shirt on, smelling of hash. And he says to the sergeant, do you have any milk? And the sergeant said, I don't have any milk. And you're leading this platoon today. So get your shirt and get it together, we're going to go out the gate, right? So in situations like that, you can talk with your editor about what you want to do, but oftentimes, if you're in places like that, it's on a silver platter. It tells you everything you have to know that these guys clearly aren't ready to take over. Yeah. And the other thing is, the great thing about being embedded is you're talking with young Marines, young soldiers. They're going to tell you exactly what they think because their attitude is, what are they going to do? Send me to Afghanistan, right? So they'll tell you, listen, sir, I've been here my third tour. It's going to take these guys 10 years before they get their act together. And then you go back to the Pentagon. The benefit of doing this, you go back to the Pentagon and someone's at the podium saying, you know, the Afghans are really doing a great job. And you raise your hand and hang on a second. Let me tell you a story about a sergeant and some milk. You know, that's the benefit of going. But also, you always want to have a plan, talking with your editor about where you want to go, what do you want to do. But oftentimes you'll arrive and the plans, just like plans in war, sometimes go away, and so other stories pop up, other places to go that you know kind of supersede your story list. So I think you have to be kind of nimble where you want to go. You clearly have to be very careful. There are certain things you know I would not have done, like get in a car with a fixer and drive to like the Khyber Pass. I mean that would just be foolhardy. But even if you're with the Marines and soldiers, anything can happen. You know. The best security guards in the world, the United States Marine Corps. But I remember we were on a patrol once, and he had one of the handheld mine detectors. And we were walking along this path, and there were things called pressure plates. If you step on it, it would ignite the charge. It was like a little plate covered with dirt. But if you step on it, it would ignite the charge and then blow up the bomb. He's walking with his handheld detector, and he steps on a pressure plate, and something went wrong. It didn't ignite. And he came back. His voice, the great thing about radio is his voice is just quavering, saying, that was bad. That was really bad.
Yeah, to say the least.
And then they exploded the bomb on their own, and it was great sound.
Great sound. Lori, you talked about some of the resources and that people have available to them that you guys give to your reporters before they go out. Do you guys tailor make those per trip, or is it kind of a list that everyone gets, a set of resources that every reporter who goes into these spaces gets, or do you have to make sure that if they're going to Syria, it looks like this, if they're going to Ukraine, it looks like this, if they're going to, Israel, it looks like this?
Oh yeah, no, it's bespoke for each situation. Though there is a template where we're asking, like I said, there's like a checklist that we go through. But I want to say something too about training. Now there is pretty widely available HEFAT training, hostile environment and first aid training, and we don't send anybody to a risky area who has not had this training. There have been times we've had terrific reporters available, but if they haven't had the training, then they're not getting sent on that story.
Lori, what does that training look like for those who don't know what it looks like? What does that training actually look like?
Yeah, I have not been through the training, but I know that it involves role playing. It involves what happens if you're kidnapped. There's first aid stuff, that people who leave that training say now they're prepared for, anything that might happen to a family member, or, a road accident, or, it's useful no matter where you are. But I think it puts you, I hear it's quite arduous, and it puts you through the paces of being in the field and the kinds of things, the unthinkable kinds of things that might happen to you, so that if you're in the field, you don't freeze in place. You've kind of been through it before, you know what you're supposed to do. So maybe it's the kind of thing the Marines used to do with reporters, but now, HEFAT training is sort of the gold standard that, everybody should go through.
I just did it 2 months ago out in,
there we go.
In Virginia. We have, British soldiers who teach us how to deal with everything from, putting on a tourniquet, a sucking chest wound, to all sorts of bleeding. If someone is unresponsive, you turn them on their side, so the blood or the vomit doesn't get down their throat and suffocate them. I think everybody should have that kind of training. It's really, really valuable. But there's also role playing too. You come on an accident that looks like an accident, or people shot up, and the first thing you do is, okay, you're seeing people clearly wounded. Make sure there's no one else around. with weapons. Make sure you're safe first. But the medical training, I think, is really, really important for anybody going to a conflict zone. And also, I do remember that in Afghanistan, the Marines wouldn't take you out on patrol unless you had your own tourniquets. You know, and some of them in these areas in Afghanistan were so dangerous, they were actually wearing their tourniquets when they went out. That's how bad it was.
Yeah. David, these kind of resources are, you know, for organizations like really all of ours, not readily available. They're becoming, you know, harder to get because of the tightening of resources around journalism. But for independent and freelancers, right, Lori talked about some things that they could do. Do you find that when you guys go out, and if you do, go and get a freelancer, go and get an independent journalist to do this kind of work, are they easier or harder to convince to pull back when something's getting dangerous?
The problem is you never know what's too dangerous.
Until it's too late.
I'm sorry?
Until it's too late.
Until it's too late, yeah. I mean, you know, I talked about whether you go down that road that might be mined or might be dangerous. You don't know. And, you know, I've been in many situations where I thought, you know, how dangerous is that? And I thought, what a stupid question. No, I have no idea. Nobody knows. There was only one time in Afghanistan, I think it was, when I was embedded with a cavalry unit and they were going to do a mission that I thought was really not smart and really dangerous. And so I said, you know what, guys, I've got a file tonight. I can't go on this mission. And that was the one time that I sort of stepped back and thought, I don't have a good feeling about this. And the mission went on and nothing happened, and so it was fine. But like I said, most of the time you just don't know. And then that question comes up, as I said, if I don't go on this mission or down this road, or if I don't take this risk, why am I here? And that's a pretty hard question to answer. So most of the time I just took a deep breath and went.
Yeah. Fred, if no one knows how dangerous these things are going to be, how do editors, how do reporters make these decisions? How do they decide before the thing pops off that, you know, actually don't go on there? How do you weigh those things? What do you weigh?
So first of all, if I had ever gone through that kind of training, I might never have gone into a war zone. I mean,
Virginia next week.
It probably would have.
I'll get you on the list.
It would have dissuaded me. So just to date myself a little bit here, so I was going behind Soviet lines in Afghanistan, dressed up as a mujahideen, and we were going across the plains carrying an arms shipment, and the only training I had was from the commander of the Mujahideen, which I have an earth-colored blanket, and if we heard a Soviet helicopter overhead, we would put it over our heads and crawl under it so we would act like a rock, and that seemed to work. And the one time when I had to use it, the question on freelancers is just such an interesting one. I was really heartened to hear from our New York Times colleague that they would not turn to a freelancer or a stringer, and I think that's the right answer. But there are a lot of people who say, you know, I'm going to go to Syria. I'm going to go to a place where there's a lot of news happening, and the majors and really most news organizations aren't sending anyone, and I can make my name there. And somebody's going to publish what I'm sending. I'm going to get a byline. I'm going to get some reputation. I'm going to write some really cool things, and I'm willing to take the risk. If those days are gone and people are not publishing their work, that's a new world for me, but I think that opportunity still exists for people. Maybe not to get involved, publish at the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, or someplace. But my guess is you can. There are 100 different ways you can publish yourself. So I think that still goes on, and I think that's a mixture of the adrenaline junkies and also a mixture of people who really care and really trying to figure it out. If I were a young reporter trying to find my way, would that be one way I might try to get editors' notice? I don't know, maybe I would. In terms of, I think the big thing we've talked about on this panel that's changed is the journalist from being collateral damage to the journalist being the target. And I think that's what one has to keep in one's head, that I have to avoid situations where I can be kidnapped. I have to not be naive and go to some place to do an interview where the person says he's got a scoop, and it's really just a way to dissuade me or to distract me and capture me. I think that's the training. The other training is all good, but this intellectual training of how not to be stupid and how not to put yourself in a situation where you become a target, you become a hostage, you become a problem for everybody, not just for yourself, but for the country and for your family and for everybody else. To me, that was the time where, to be honest, I was less eager to go into certain situations because I could, if I'm managing a situation and I just need to not put myself in the wrong place to get shot, that's one thing. Mm-hmm. If I'm managing a situation where I could be targeted and somebody could follow me and then grab me because having a Wall Street Journal journalist in captivity would be good for their organization, that's a different set of challenges.
Yeah. Do we have questions from the audience? Okay. Let's grab a mic. Thank you.
Yes, I do have a question. My name is Uliana. I'm Ukrainian journalist here in DC and doing freelance for Ukrainian media and for US media as well. And my question is about, from reporter side, how to make story for editor to catch, how to make the story to catch editor's eyes, because it's been a year and a half I was working with a story about Americans who were killed on the battlefield in Ukraine. And for me, it was a big struggle to get those stories to publish in US media. So I would love to know your maybe advice or how to catch editors' eyes on a good, powerful story. Thank you.
Thank you. Lori, let's go to you for that one. What are the kinds of things when reporters pitch stories to you that actually make you say, you know what, actually, that's a really good idea. That's something that they should be doing.
Well, basically, is it something we don't know? It's really hard when you're covering a long-running conflict. There is I hate to say it, but there's a sameness about it. So what are you telling us that's new that we didn't know before? Is there a difference in, has the battle changed in any way? Are civilians being affected differently in any way? What is it about, I don't know what the story was that you were pitching, but, that's probably the most important thing is, does it feel revelatory, in any way? And then if it's something that, in Ukraine, we have an awful lot of reporters in Ukraine. It is a conflict we have been able to access. So what is it that you're offering or you have, your story has that is exclusive, that would mean that, somebody would work with an unknown, untested freelancer, because they have to trust you. The editors have to trust you, but also they have to, feel like it's what you have is something that nobody else or their own reporters aren't coming up with.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience?
My own answer to that it would be, and this was back in a time when, in the position I was in the Wall Street Journal, we would work once in a while with stringers and freelancers. Rare would be the moment where somebody would contact me from someplace for the first time and say, oh, here's a story, will you take it? It's more before the person goes there. It doesn't have to be a war zone. It doesn't have to be a place of conflict. It can be
any story.
It can be going to Turkey and writing feature stories or something. But you really want to know the pedigree of that journalist, the background, the capability of the person. You sort of wanted to meet the person either in person, I guess now by Zoom or whatever. But I think getting a pitch for the first time from a situation like that, I would look a little bit askance at that and would want to have a lot more checks on credibility before I would ever take something like that. As an editor, I would have wanted to know that person far ahead of time. And to be honest, the the more important the story is, the closer you want to be to that person, and the more you'd want that to be a staffer anyway. But if it's not a staffer, you want somebody that's fully vetted and somebody you have full trust in. And then, you know, if it's that kind of person, that person's going to know how to write a story that's going to catch an editor's eye. And the danger of someone who's trying to catch an editor's eye is you can get some hype, you can get some invention, you can, as an editor, you have to be so with an unknown writer, unknown person, you have to be just so incredibly careful with the sourcing, incredibly careful about how the story has come together.
So reach out to them early, often, like we tell kids, and get to know the editor before you pitch.
Oh, sure. Yes, good afternoon. I would like to hear some good news about where you took a risk and it paid off. I know there's a lot of other situations where people sometimes, it doesn't pan out and they take a risk, but do you have some good examples of where it's good business, where, like you said, you've got to vet the reporter and an opportunity, but when it does turn out, does it really bring in a larger audience, and does it help expand the effectiveness of the venue?
Tom, do you want to take this one?
Well, again, I think there's a certain amount of risk just going to a conflict zone. One story that I remember and fondly is I was at this combat outpost. And again, this is where stories just kind of drop in your lap. And I was talking with this executive officer for this 101st Airborne Company. And this is in Afghanistan, he had lost his leg in Iraq. And if he was walking across the company, you couldn't tell he had lost his leg. I mean, prosthetic was that good. And so it was really a story about him, right? And he'd show me where his bunk is, and I have a leg for running, I have a leg for walking. Just a great guy, great, enthusiastic guy, really positive guy. And so I kind of doing a profile of him, and then we came under attack on my last day there, and I'm drinking coffee out back. And the day before, the Afghans were like firing into the hills and doing some target practice or whatever. So I thought that's what was going on. And this guy comes running around the corner and says, "We're under attack." And I'm like, oh my God. So I held my cup of coffee, I had my recorder, and I went up against a sandbag wall and just held my recorder up to get all the sound of the gunfire. And all of a sudden, this helicopter comes overhead, this attack helicopter, shoots off a missile, and I got all the sound of this missile going off. So it was just bang, bang. It was like the Alamo. It was great. And this guy who had lost a leg, who I already did a profile on, he was in the command center, and it was a concrete building, and there was a window up above that had plywood in it. A round came through that wood, bounced all around the room, and dropped right next to him. And he walks up to me when the firefight was over. He holds it. It's like a little bent bullet. It looks like a talon. And he said, "After all I've been through, can you imagine me getting killed sitting in the command center?" So it was risky, but it was just such a great, wonderful story. He was a great guy. So that's one where, and then when I got home, people saying, "Oh my God, thank God you're okay." And I didn't want to tell them, I just got this by holding my recorder up and drinking a cup of coffee. But that was, risk and reward.
Can I take a stab at this?
Sure.
Look, with the wisdom of age and having been in troubled situations and having been in less troubled situations, you can report the first draft of history, as Phil Graham called it, without getting shot at and without taking risk. And so I'll give you an example of risk that was absolutely useless, and I never should have done it, and I almost got killed. And then something that I did that wasn't risky at all that made my career. And so the risk was I was in a place called Tripoli in Lebanon, covering a fight, a war between Palestinian factions. And for whatever reason, I decided I wanted to do a profile in this situation of Yasser Arafat. So I figured out where he was, and a fixer got me together with him. And it just so happened that the other Palestinian faction knew where he was too. And so they were going to shoot, I guess in this case it was mortar shells, wherever they thought he was. And so he would only stay in a place for 10, 15 minutes and they would move on. I didn't know that. So I met him in a place, in a building that was preset, and I got there ahead of him, and then he came in, and then after 10 minutes of conversation where I can't even remember what he told me, I certainly didn't write anything about it, a mortar hits the building, he flees, I start going down, and more shots are going, and the great thing about that story is they were just such terrible shots, and they never got close to hitting any of us, but it was Palestinian factions fighting in Tripoli for 10 minutes for Yasser Arafat, and I might have died. I mean, do you know how stupid that was? And how crazy it was that I did that day? You know, and if I had thought a couple of moments about this, but then covering Solidarity in the booth of Solidarity in Poland, shipyard strikes, the beginning of journalism, there was a lot of danger of imprisonment to them, but boy, I was writing the first draft of history. I saw Solidarity change the world. I saw, over time, it sent that stone rolling that brought down the Soviet Union and brought down the Berlin Wall. And I was there in the beginning in August of 1980, and there was no risk to that at all, physical risk. And so I think sometimes reporters just have to say, where can I find the most important story for people to read about today? And it doesn't have to involve anything kinetic. And so I'm happy I did all these silly, stupid things, but when people are war correspondents, or people, I wasn't a war correspondent, I just happened to do war a couple of times. Some people are war correspondents, they do this all the time. But when they get together, they talk about the people they've lost, they talk about the close shaves they had, and they also talk about, was any one of those stories worth it?
Never.
Right? And it's, at the time, it really seemed like the smart thing to do. And I'm glad I did a lot of it. But if I had to start it all over, I still would have gone with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. I would have done that for sure. And I would have covered Beirut, and I would have tried to understand what was going on there. I would have gotten nowhere near Tripoli on that day with Yasser Arafat.
Eugene, can I just interject something?
We have a question from the audience here. It's to Tom here, but I'm actually going to give it to you. It's from Alia Abdallah. They supported NPR teams in Lebanon as field security advisor and fixer. The question is, from your experience, how do you maintain narrative integrity when field conditions, access, security, local pressure threaten to distort the story?
How do you maintain narrative integrity?
How do you maintain narrative integrity when field conditions? So how do you make sure that the story that you sent the reporter over there to get stays that story, despite all of the pressures, local access and security are in play?
Well, there's a lot of different ways to answer that question, but I think one of the things that I found in Iraq and Afghanistan was that when things got hot and there were bullets flying, I was so people often say, weren't you scared? I didn't have time to be scared. I was trying to figure out, there's a story, there's a narrative arc, there's color, there's dialogue, there's action, there's the way it smells. I was trying to capture it. I'm busy writing in my notebook and stuff is flying around. And then, later on that afternoon or evening when you have time to sit down but the story is almost written itself. So I never had trouble forming a story and maintaining that narrative arc. Most of the stuff that I wrote were short pieces about what was going on, not in a tactical sense, but in a human sense. What was this like? What did it feel like? What were guys thinking? But that brings up something I wanted to mention, and that is that so much of what I did in my career was finding the worst, the most tragic, the most awful, the most shocking thing to write about, because, I think there's a Fleet Street adage, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so my editors, I don't think they ever urged me to do this, but they certainly never turned down a story that was built on something that was so horrible that, it just was very dramatic. The problem is that at some point you begin to realize, I'm building my career on the misery of other people. And that's not okay. And there came a point in my career when I just said, I'm done with this, can't do this anymore. And to get back to this idea of resilience, the thing that I found almost by accident was, having been through 10 years of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, I had an opportunity to spend a year with Americans who'd been wounded in combat and their caregivers to write about what their lives were like after they got wounded, and celebrated their Alive Day, which was the day that they didn't die and got a second chance. And that was so wonderful to write about, to meet these people. It was very uplifting and inspiring, and I'm just happy that I got a chance to do that. But talk about resilience, I think that's one of the keys that I found. In retrospect, I can see the opportunities that I had to write about something positive and not about the most awful thing that I saw.
Yeah. I'm going to get in trouble with the producers because I have one more question I was supposed to wrap. Lori, in just about a minute or a minute and a half here, with all that's been said about the dangers that happen, the concerns that when folks go overseas and do conflict reporting or just do foreign reporting in general, why should anyone do this? Why should reporters, why should editors, why is this still an important job for folks to do?
It's a good question, because hearing all this, there might be people who think, well, why bother? And yet, to me, it's the most important work you can do. I think we have a reporter who answered that question recently. Declan Walsh and Ivor Prickett were in Khartoum in March. It was their second trip to Sudan. That's a country that's been at war for 2 years. And, relative to the wars in Ukraine and in Gaza, there's actually been very little coverage and therefore very little awareness of that war, which is, the worst displacement crisis, in some ways the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now. And so they managed to get in, which is through a lot of persistence, very hard to do. They got to Khartoum. They happened to be there when the army was taking back control of the presidential palace and much of the city. And so they were out reporting the day that, the jubilant army is taking over the presidential palace and people are cheering. And then people see these two Irish, journalists and start cheering for them too. And so Declan says that he walked over to a woman and said, "Why are you cheering for us?" And she said, "Well, we've, been at war here for 2 years, and you are the first outsiders we have seen. We thought the world had forgotten about the Sudanese people. And so it gives us hope that you're here and you're chronicling what we're doing." And that's what the work is. I mean, it's to bear witness, often in, the most dangerous parts of the world, because, the people there are suffering more than anywhere else in the world. And so, we're doing a service, and it's important work to do.
With that, Lori, thank you very much for that story. To everyone on the panel, thank you very much. And Fred, I think you're wrapping us up here.
Yeah, I think I'll wrap from here. I'm not going to go there, but I'm going to pass to Adrian to say a word too. I'm going to read you something. I wrote this in March 2002. It was after a memorial service for my friend Danny. It was pretty poignant, and it was at St. Bride's Church, at St. Bride's Cathedral in London, which is known as the Journalist Church. One British reporter told me that Its home just off Fleet Street is the closest God ever dared come to the media. And it's profanity wash printing plants and pubs. And that's where Danny Pearl and all his friends and colleagues decided to gather. And I won't recount the whole thing that I wrote, but just one paragraph. In conversations with friends in the past days, one engages more in confession than war stories. What terrible mistakes did we survive? What less honorable motivations had we long concealed? What stories had we failed to tell? We still assure ourselves that we risked our skin to serve humanity's need to know the truth, and I'm sure we did. Yet some admit yielding to the addiction of danger's morphine. Others found page one play to be the most potent drug. Good outcomes often have complex motivations. And so I think it's crucial to be out there telling the story. Right now, I don't think we're learning much about Gaza because there aren't many people in there that can tell the story. And we're learning a lot about Putin, what Putin is doing in Ukraine, because the reporters are there telling the story. So I think we have to continue to try to do whatever we can to tell the stories that the world needs to hear. And we have to train the right journalists in the right way and give them the right precautions, and not do it in ways that add more heat than light and put people in danger without any real purpose or outcome. So let me close with that. So it's 40 years after my friend Terry Anderson was kidnapped, and 23 years after Danny was beheaded and murdered. And it's a few months shy of Evan Gershkovich's release, and we worked on that some here at the Atlantic Council as well. And so I'm really glad that this is a good time to raise awareness of the risks faced by reporters around the world. And Lori, it was great to have you on screen, and Tom and Daniel, thanks as well. And Eugene, I've been following your work for a long time, and it's great to see you in the flesh here. Before we close, I want to pass to Adrienne Arsht, who's a real hero of reporters everywhere. She just, if you go over to her house, you're always going to see some stray correspondents and anchor people and people who really love this craft. So let me pass the podium to you to say a couple of closing things.
Well, I think we've overstayed our cocktail time, but I'll be brief and thank everybody. And only to say that I get asked, why did I focus on this? Where did my interest in resilience come? And I will just say very briefly that in December of 1969, my sister, who was then 25, was in the Foreign Service in Moscow. She was fluent in Russian and Czech. She had been there a number of times as a translator. She was taken by the KGB, and for some period of time, could have been a few hours or days, and released. She was probably the first reporter to whom, or person to whom, that was done. We've had from Evan Gershkovich to Bob Toth and many others, and we're more sophisticated now. We recognize, but when it happened to my sister, nobody knew what it was, and the KGB accused her of being a spy, said they'd let her out if she was a double agent. She got out, and they let her out, and she came back to the United States, and I think they'd call it PTSD today, but she suffered deeply and attempted suicide and subsequently committed suicide. And I wondered, and I continue to wonder, what is resilience, and who has it, and how do we encourage it? And the question I wish I could have asked you all is, have you ever told a reporter, don't go, and the reporter does? And what is it that makes people do this? It's important that we hear from the ground, but it's a very topic that fascinates me. I'm not a human who is very brave at all, and I admire those who do and who work with them. Thank you.
And so please join us outside in the appropriately named for today, Adrienne Arsht Sky Lobby. It's not just the generosity of our Sky Lobby that Adrienne has given us, but she's also inspired this whole Reporters at Risk series, the Adrienne Arsht National Security Resilience Initiative, which is in our Scowcroft Center. So Adrienne, thanks for that. Thanks to everybody here, and please join us for a beverage which would only be befitting the foreign correspondent.